Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a really awesome interview. It's definitely a longer one. It's really great though. Definitely worth your while to stick around and watch the whole way through. This is with Dylan Platt. He's got some really great tips and a lot of things that we haven't heard before from other counselors. So definitely stick around for this one, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so to start off here, could you just start us off with a little introduction of yourself?
Yeah, of course. Well, my name is Dylan Platt. I am a genetic counselor at Sanford Health in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I've been here for the last about 2 years. I actually did my training at Augustana, which is kind of the sister site to Sanford Health. So I've been at Sanford doing my training at least for the last about 4.5 years. So fairly familiar with the system, primarily in peds as well as research. So kind of a dual role here.
That's awesome. And so you said you did go to the Augustana program. Could you tell me a little bit about why you ended up going to that program?
Yeah, of course. Well, I actually did my undergrad at Augie as well, so that was a pretty big driving factor, just being familiar with the school, as well as my wife is from Sioux Falls, so she was a pretty big deciding factor, as one might expect when they have a significant other. But it definitely wasn't the only program that I applied to. So I think it was probably familiarity with the school, having obviously a draw or a close relationship with the geographical area, and then also just really appreciating the program and the people and the culture that I was familiar with.
Okay, that's very interesting. I kind of have a similar, as I'm thinking about where I'm going to apply and everything, my undergrad has a genetic counseling program here at Pitt. So that's
Mhm.
kind of an interesting similar factor. I wonder how that'll end up working out, but definitely makes sense that you stuck around.
I think it's beneficial to there's people that fall into different camps when it comes to applying. There's the shotgun approach, which is apply to as many schools as quick as possible. I don't really appreciate that, just because it's one, an economic burden for a lot of people, and two, it's you're potentially spreading yourself too thin in terms of your actual application process. I like the more focused approach where you pick, two, three, maybe four programs that you feel like you have a really big draw to, like yourself with Pitt, or possibly if you're from another area or you have family in another area that has a program, applying to places that have some sort of draw or some sort of enticement for yourself. And then I feel like it's easier to portray that in an application, which I think resonates with a program more so than it seems like this individual just kind of applied to everything and anything.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've noticed as the applications for this coming cycle have started opening up and reading the different requirements for things like a personal statement, for example, from all these programs, it seems like a lot of them want you to talk about their program specifically instead of just a generic personal statement, which led me to believe when people apply to like, over six, seven, eight, more than that many schools, definitely it seems like it'd be hard to convey a genuine desire to go to all those different programs if that number is getting up that high.
Mhm. Some people might be able to if they're really
Yeah,
creative,
maybe.
but that wasn't me.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that you're in the field, what would an average day as a genetic counselor look like for you?
It's kind of different day to day, just because I have kind of a dual role in terms of my time is kind of split 50% with clinic, 50% with more research minded activities. Um, so from a clinical perspective, I primarily see pediatrics in a multidisciplinary clinic type setting. So a little bit different than the traditional like peds rotation that somebody going through a program would probably experience. Hopefully, you would get some experience with some multidisciplinary clinics as well, but it's really more focused on working as a team. You typically see anywhere from 4 to 7, 8 patients during a day, and they're kind of quicker visits, with the caveat that it could potentially go longer depending on what particular topics the family or the individual wants to speak about. But then obviously I do have kind of a more traditional clinical setting. So that is more of your traditional working with an MD geneticist in terms of a kind of a dual role type of, you have your genetic counselor going in, you have your geneticist going in, working through the consenting process, the actual counseling process of genetic counseling. And then obviously on the back end, you have the fun side of insurance. You have to also be cognizant of time when it comes to returning results like that. And then from a research perspective, it's much more, sometimes that can be a little bit more transient. The nice thing about genetic counseling is that oftentimes your role, you don't have to stick to a very strict schedule. Now that may be institution dependent, but you do typically tend to have time to, tool your particular schedule to what is needed at the time. If you have results that you need to immediately call out, you can do that. If you have, in my neck of the woods, research that you need to attend to, you can do that before going on to other things. So, that is kind of what a day-to-day or week-to-week basis looks like for myself.
Okay, that's very interesting. If you don't mind speaking a little more on the research, I'm kind of curious because when I think of research, I think of, a lab bench and like doing wet lab stuff, all that kind of stuff. But from what I've seen with some of the current genetic counseling students, like on a program, and if it lists what they're doing for their thesis project, a lot of them seem to be more of humanities kind of research about different things with the field, like accessibility and diversity and things like that. So where does your research fall in that kind of spectrum?
I think it's natural to you think genetics and you kind of automatically think mouse models and petri dishes and isolating DNA and going through that kind of hard science lab bench work. So I think that's a very natural association when it comes to genetics and research. But you kind of hit the nail on the head with genetic counseling. Throughout your program, you obviously have a research component of that typically has to do with more social, more counseling, more humanitarian type of projects. For me specifically, where I'm at right now, Sanford has several years ago, Sanford launched kind of a population-based genomic screening program. So we're really in the throes of identifying the different clinical outcomes as well on both a positive and a quote unquote uninformative side of things, because it's a genotyping platform, which basically means that you can't say that somebody received a true negative result if they received a negative result, which therefore the term uninformative comes from. So I think population-based research is going to be at the forefront of a lot of genomics research in general. I think genetic counselors should feel an obligation and a desire to be part of that, because once we start branching out into population-based screening, if that truly does become a kind of ubiquitous option for individuals across the states as well as the rest of the world, we already know that there's a shortage of genetic counselors. So we're going to need research to indicate what is the best way to approach the largest number of people, almost trying to take more of a utilitarian type of approach to genomics, because it's going to be impossible for us to reach everybody. So we need to reach the individuals that need it the most in terms of the actual hard counseling aspect of it, but then also making sure that we have those pillars that can hold up the rest of the program for those individuals that may not necessarily have the opportunity to meet one-on-one with a genetic specialist. They may be meeting primarily just with their PCP in a clinic to talk about their results. So differentiating, do we only see positive individuals? Do we see both positive and uninformative or negative individuals that have particular questions? Is there some type of screening protocol at the front end of things that allows us to, yes, we'll see all of the positives, but we're also going to see all of the negatives or uninformatives that have some type of uh, red flag in either their personal or family history based off of that kind of baseline assessment. So really trying to branch into what is the future of genomics going to look like, because we know we're a growing field, but I don't think that our populace at this point is going to be able to reach or is going to have far enough reach to, kind of bring everybody in immediately, at least.
Okay, that's a really, really good point. You kind of reminded me, and I see what you're saying, because although it is a very, it's exciting how rapidly the field is growing and the projection it has, but at the same time, it's still, pretty small. But as of this past year, with a lot of things transitioning to being virtual, do you think that has increased accessibility or the ability for you guys to spread your influence at all?
I think that depends. That might depend on the institution. Um, some institutions were already set up to do some type of virtual access. Other institutions probably weren't set up to do virtual access. And unfortunately, we have to deal with the shit show that is not being able to be reimbursed in a lot of instances for our services, and telemed makes that even harder. So that can also sometimes be a difficult aspect of expansion. That being said, at least from the Sanford perspective, I think we've done a really good job of reaching out to more rural communities. However, we've kind of already been doing that in a person-to-person type or in-face type basis for many years at this point. But telemed really will, a combination of both telemed as well as other AI or technology type counseling tools or bots will likely be in our future to different degrees and for different reasons. So I think, again, if we, future genetic counselors like yourself are already asking those questions and have that at the forefront, that's going to be really important to think about. How do we integrate with technology? Because there's going to be a lot of fields in healthcare that probably get usurped by technology. How can we make sure that us as genetic counselors, probably focusing more on the counseling side of things, do not get usurped by this technology? Because I think there's a lot to be said about a human-to-human, face-to-face interaction, or screen-to-screen interaction, just because we're social creatures. So I think that's important to recognize as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and also a really good security or benefit of this field, because if you are going to integrate technology to whatever degree, maybe you can integrate that through a good percentage of what a normal clinical visit would be in terms of explaining the genetic situation that the patient is going through. But when you get to the portion of the counseling, that seems like it'd be very difficult to replicate without an actual human. So I guess that is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Is that in our future in 100 years? Possibly, if AI continues and the human race doesn't kill ourselves off. Yeah. But I think for now, we have really good job security in terms of the counseling aspect of genetic counseling.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, with your pediatric specialty, what led you to go down that path? I know you are exposed to all the different specialties in your rotations, but what made you go down that specific path?
So I know your audience is probably familiar with kind of the five main specialties that you get exposure to: prenatal, cancer, adult, peds, and lab. A lot of those specialties, at least for myself, it seemed like had kind of, they were very similar on a case-to-case or day-to-day basis. That being said, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in every single specialty, and you always have to be prepared for that. But I felt like peds was very much, you did not know what was going to happen on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like personally, I kind of thrive in that that constant flux or just kind of controlled chaos type of setting. So I think that's what really drew me into the pediatric setting, as well as the fact that um, in the cancer setting, in the prenatal setting, oftentimes when you're giving a diagnosis or bad news, it truly is taken as bad news. It's still taken as bad news oftentimes in the peds setting, but there's a lot of times where these families have been going through the diagnostic odyssey for 5, 7 more years, and finally receiving a diagnosis, regardless of necessarily what the prognosis is. Finally receiving a diagnosis is oftentimes taken as good news. And we have a tough job as genetic counselors. There's a lot of burnout in the field, but I think any way that you can find some type of reprieve from that and some type of way to share in a positive emotion with patients and families, I think the PED setting offers that pretty well for some people.
Okay, that's really interesting you say that. I think I'm kind of the same way with kind of liking that controlled chaos and that having a different kind of situation every day. But you touched on, so the fact that it's often taken as a bit more of good news because these people are looking for a solution for so long. Now, this may be a misconception, but I'm curious if you can talk about it at all. With the way I think about the pediatric, or maybe even a prenatal, but I guess maybe pediatric more specialty, is that because they're younger, perhaps there is more you can do as future steps after the session to mitigate any kind of negative consequences of their condition. Do you think that's true at all, or is that kind of a case by case thing?
That's going to be, yeah, like you mentioned, that's going to be very case to case. I think the cases are going to expand in the future. We're obviously coming up with more and more targeted treatments, either from a medication standpoint, from a gene therapy standpoint, from a gene replacement or enzyme replacement therapy standpoint, as well as starting to get into thinking about, gene editing technologies. Now that comes with all of those different areas come with um, their own ethical implications that we really do as a field need to speak about and to be inclusive in terms of who comes to that table, which I don't think has necessarily been done yet to this point, but that's a separate issue. So in terms of getting to your specific question, I think that it's case to case and those cases are expanding. And yes, I think we're going to have an option or an opportunity for many genetic conditions currently and into the future where we can offer more of a kind of hard treatment or hard solution to their quote unquote concerns or problems. But that being said, the PED setting also offers you, especially in multidisciplinary type settings, it offers you a good opportunity to have that continued follow-up on a semi-annual or on an annual or on a biannual basis. So you get to know the families better. You get to experience their joys in terms of welcoming more kiddos into the family. You get to share in their sorrows in terms of that initial diagnosis and if things start to change for their kiddo as it goes through on a day-to-day basis or a year-to-year basis. But you're also there to hopefully help try to pick back up the pieces and to walk through and help to, get some of those psychological and psychosocial aspects figured out for them as well, or be kind of a crutch for them if necessary. So I also enjoy that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, that's really, really exciting. Those all seem like really great reasons to stick with that field and that specialty. So within the parameters of patient privacy and everything, could you share about a very memorable or difficult case that you've encountered and how you dealt with that?
I think the one that has stuck with me the most is a case that I saw while I was going through training, and it actually spanned several units for myself. So you get 8-week rotations is typically what you do during your second year, and this case played out probably over 3 of those rotations for myself. And in particular, the possible diagnosis in question was Huntington disease. I feel like if, as a student, you have an opportunity either at your institution that you're following with, or if you can possibly go to an outside institution and get some type of exposure to, I think working with Huntington families and Huntington patients is probably the most um, possibly difficult aspect of genetic counseling in general, but also probably the most rewarding because it truly is genetic counseling at its core. You're really not worried about explaining the technicalities of the testing. You're really not worried about explaining what Huntington looks like. Because if somebody is coming to you to talk about Huntington disease, they know. They've lived through it, they've experienced it. There's no reason for you to beat a dead horse and tell them what it would look like. So you truly are doing, you're not really doing genetics, you're doing counseling through and through. And the reason why it played out over such a long period for myself is because there are kind of national recommendations about how the testing process for Huntington should go. You have pre-test, you have a kind of second check-in, you have the draw, and then you have the results disclosure. And I was actually able to do all of those different aspects with a single individual. Thankfully, thankfully I was disclosing negative results at the very end, but it was an emotional roller coaster. I think both for the patient as well as my supervisor and myself to kind of go through that entire experience. So I think anybody that can get exposure to Huntington disease in a particular clinic, or maybe you just have a neuromuscular genetic counselor that you're following with, or maybe it's just a patient that pops up in an adult clinic setting, don't shy away from that opportunity. It can be probably extremely daunting to think about counseling an individual or a family about Huntington disease, but challenge yourself. And especially when you're going through your training, you have a backstop behind you. You have a supervisor behind you that has experience, most likely counseling that exact referral indication. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of the really difficult cases, both in the Huntington world as well as in like the prenatal world, having to give a really difficult diagnosis of a lethal condition. Take advantage of that, because you don't want the first time that you're counseling about Huntington, the first time that you're counseling about trisomy 18 or 13 or lethal skeletal dysplasia, you don't want the first time that's happening to be your second day on the job when you're a real genetic counselor and there's no backstop behind you. So that would probably be a big piece of advice that I would give any, any person contemplating genetic counseling as well as currently in programs, is take advantage of those really difficult situations while you can and while you have a backstop.
That's such great advice. I've not specifically heard that advice yet, but that totally makes sense. While you have the training and the supervision, I mean, challenging yourself like that is always the best way to grow, as far as I've experienced. So I really like that.
I think a lot of people surprise themselves. Just genetic counseling, you're having difficult conversations on a day-to-day basis. So you have to learn that adversity is being comfortable in uncomfortable situations.
Absolutely. That's really good advice. I've kind of experienced that. I mean, on a much smaller scale, but as I'm preparing for applications, and I've started doing crisis counseling this summer. And that was something I was admittedly a little bit nervous about starting, because I didn't know how to be able to support these people. Obviously, they put us through a lot of training, and I felt pretty prepared. But just throwing myself into it, and hearing people, say how they actually felt supported, and I was actually doing it, getting better with each conversation, I can kind of see how that might play out on a bigger scale in a real genetic counseling program.
Yeah, I think you're introducing yourself to those exact situations. And to borrow a phrase, I can't remember which boxer said it, but it goes something like, everybody can take a punch in theory until you get hit in the face. So make sure that you're getting hit in the face, both in training as well as before training, to make sure that this is something that you're truly passionate about and feel comfortable taking on those difficult conversations and situations. So you're doing a great job in terms of setting yourself up for the future by being in those kind of crisis situations.
Yeah, thank you. I love that advice. That's really great. So I'm wondering what you would say is the most rewarding part of being a counselor, if you could pinpoint anything.
I think I think people get into genetic counseling because they have a really strong interest in healthcare, and they are obviously bright individuals, so they want to continue their education past the undergrad level into graduate, and many go beyond onto doctorates and PhDs. So, but I think the core value of individuals that tend to go into this is they are those social creatures. They like to help their fellow human being. They like to speak to their fellow human being on a day-to-day basis. So I'd say that is probably the most rewarding. And then also being able to walk with a patient through multiple aspects, both the ups and the downs, I think is very rewarding.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask you a little follow-up on that, because you reminded me earlier when you said, you have the ups and the downs, and at the end of that memorable case, you were able to disclose a positive information through, I guess, a negative result, or a conclusive result that they did not have whatever condition. But I had the idea when I started thinking about this that a lot of times you are giving that bad news, if you want to frame it that way. But when I spoke with another counselor before, she said, well, she was mentioning how a lot of times you can give good news, and it's, that can be a very great feeling. So I know you can't really put any numbers on it or what percentage of the time is good versus bad, but would you be able to speak at all to how those good news things kind of play out?
I think I might want to kind of back up a little bit and just say that um, I think oftentimes we as genetic counselors and healthcare professionals fall into the trap of we attribute a positive or a negative feeling to a particular result. So what I may see as giving good news to a patient, a negative result, they may view as bad news because they didn't receive an answer. And now they're continuing down their diagnostic odyssey. What I may see as a positive result giving a negative Huntington disease result may be taken as a very bad result from the individual, because say the individual I'm speaking with and their sibling went through testing at the same time. Their sibling is positive, they are negative. They could now have a lot of survivor's guilt and negative feelings associated with that negative result, which in part was one of those feelings that my particular patient was going through. But that being said, I guess the biggest question, or the biggest advice I would say in terms of the giving good news, giving bad news debate is just, we're going to do it no matter what. We're going to be happy when we're giving a particular result, or we're going to be sad when we're giving a particular result. Just try not to have your thoughts and feelings be portrayed in how you give a result. Results should be given at a fairly kind of even level, and then you play off of what the patient or the family is giving you, and you either match their positivity, match their kind of less positive attitudes about a particular result. But in general, I do think that oftentimes you'll necessarily know if a family is going to take a result positive, like they've been on a journey for a very long time, and we now finally have a diagnosis, and it's a diagnosis that doesn't have like a decreased life expectancy or something like that. Oftentimes then you know that it's going to be a really exciting disclosure. Or if you have a patient that is just going to be completely distraught by a positive result because they told you about that in pre-test counseling, but we got a negative result, then we can also share in those positive emotions there. So I think in terms of quantifying which one happens more or less, it's difficult. It's probably 50-50, just because everybody takes things so differently. So what you think is a positive outcome is probably 50-50 split in between what they think is a positive or a less than positive outcome, and vice versa with a negative result. So, you know, I think it goes back to that being comfortable in chaos. You never know what you're going to get.
That's a really good point. I appreciate you adjusting my perspective on that, because I really hadn't thought about it that way, to be honest, especially with the survivor's guilt kind of aspect, or if someone had been, they wanted at least some result instead of something that's completely inconclusive or whatever. But yeah, I appreciate that. I really hadn't thought about it that way. So on the flip side, could you pinpoint anything that would be the most challenging aspect of your career?
Well, I think a lot of people have probably told you about insurance, so
Yeah.
maybe I won't beat a dead horse there. Probably insurance and reimbursement are two of the big ones. Um, Another, I think, difficult aspect for a lot of counselors is being able to shut off. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of burnout in genetic counseling and just the healthcare field in general. So if you're thinking about going into genetic counseling, probably start reading some literature about what burnout is, about why burnout happens. For me, I have been an athlete and a baseball player my entire life. So I kind of took the same approach that I had with baseball and sports into my career in genetic counseling, and the fact that I have I have, you know, routines that kind of turn me on for the day and then turn me off for the day. So being able to have those routines, for me, it's, you know, particular songs on my car ride into work, particular songs on my car ride out of work. It is kind of my on off switch. Being able to separate work and home life is really important, especially if you have a family that you're going home to, because like we've already spoken about multiple times, you're going to be giving difficult news oftentimes. You're going to be in difficult situations oftentimes, and those should weigh on you, but hopefully they're only weighing on you at work, in the sessions, and not necessarily at home in your life. So I think that's probably a very difficult aspect of the job for a lot of genetic counselors, is knowing when to turn off, when to turn off, or sorry, when to turn on, when to turn off, and knowing those particular strategies for yourself, because everybody's going to be very different in terms of how they do that. Knowing those strategies that help you turn on and off before you get into a program, I think is a beneficial aspect before going in.
That's really, really smart. I've not really experienced something where, or had kind of an activity where I've utilized an on off like that, but that's really interesting. I'll definitely try to integrate that as I'm going forward. And you just reminded me also, when you're speaking about going home and everything, could you speak a little bit on the work-life balance that you've experienced? That might be different based on, you know, the place you're actually working, I guess, but if you have any insight on that.
That's probably going to be, like you mentioned, different on institution to institution. I think it's very rare that genetic counselors are on call. However, it does happen sometimes that you're on call. And then there's also the fact that, like here in Sioux Falls, even though we have a pretty small population, we have about 15 counselors in our immediate organization. So that's pretty exceptional. Whereas you may be at a much more populous city or in a populous state and be one of three counselors that are providing multiple different services, or potentially your institution only offers one type of service for genetic counseling. So it's going to be different in that regard too. So if you have the option, as myself, to distribute the amount of work, then I think work-life balance becomes much easier than if you are the only counselor or one of three counselors that has to do all 18 specialties at once. So that can be difficult. And it's also probably a very big intentionality thing, similar to the conversation about turning on and turning off in terms of our kind of emotional vulnerability about particular situations so that we're not we're preventing it from affecting our home life. It's very similar with our just work-life balance in general, is that you have to be intentional about saying, this is my time at work, this is my time at home with my son, my daughter, my wife, my husband, my significant other, whoever it may be. So just being intentional. Like some things that I've heard people do is don't put your work email on your phone, because if you have it on your phone, you're probably going to look at it. I know even when I'm at home, I think I'm pretty good at turning off my work when I get home, but I still look at my work email when I get home. So maybe there's some aspects that I need to improve upon there, if it starts affecting me at home or at work or whatever it may be. Some other strategies, other people's strategies may be very different in terms of how they separate that work-life balance. Maybe it's at a certain time, they just stop thinking about work, or it's at a certain point in their routine, they get home, and once they start chopping the onion for dinner, then they're officially home. So just being intentional about what you do, just like you're intentional about how you counsel during a session, you should be intentional about how you go home after a session.
Awesome. That's very smart advice. Even the work email on the phone, I didn't think about that or hear that. And obviously, with any career, it seems like the work-life balance is important to be able to shut yourself off. But with something like this that carries such an emotional significance, obviously, it's even that much more important.
I think you mentioning the fact that work-life balance is important in any career is really important, because there's probably going to be some people watching this that don't end up going into genetic counseling, but that can be a great take-home message. No matter what you do in your life, for a job, for a career, for anything else, there needs to be separation. And the great news is, if you're a nerd, like probably a lot of us are, there's a lot of literature out there about how to be intentional about that separation. So I encourage people to read about that if they're interested as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm definitely going to try to read up on that and the burnout that you were talking about as well, in terms of how that's handled and what's out there written about it right now. And so then the last question I have for you is a piece of advice you would give to someone in my position who's getting ready to apply to genetic counseling school. I know you gave me some pretty good advice earlier about more of like an attitude and a mentality to carry during the training and everything else. But in terms of maybe something a little more tangible for something you experienced in the application process and interviews and all that kind of thing.
So I think probably my big three are, again, intentionality. Be intentional about the places that you apply. I'm a big proponent of, again, not the shotgun approach. Also, whatever you do before applying, a lot of people feel like you need to check every single box in order to get into a program, which the competition is heating up. It is difficult to get into programs at this point. So you do have to, quote unquote, check the skills that are encompassed in those boxes, but you don't necessarily have to check those boxes. A lot of people do crisis counseling. A lot of people work as GCAs or whatever it may be. But you can get similar experiences from doing other things. For myself, I never did crisis counseling. I was a baseball coach for multiple years. And I felt like having those difficult conversations with cutting kids from high school after they've been playing their entire life up to a certain point, those are difficult conversations to have. Having conversations with players after a really crappy game when they should have performed much, much better, that can be a difficult conversation. Just find those avenues. I think the crux of crisis counseling is increasing your communicative skills, because what is genetic counseling at the end of the day? It is the ability to communicate both difficult concepts to understand, as well as just connecting with an individual through communication. So find those different things, whether it be coaching, crisis counseling, something like a peer-to-peer type mentorship program, or something like public speaking. work on your communication skills, because that's what's going to shine through once your application has got you through the door. Your communication skills are what is going to shine through in terms of an interview and actually get you into the program. That's the most important part. And then, so that's number 2, is kind of don't feel like you have to check all the boxes. Just make sure that you're gaining skills that are located in those boxes. I'm a big proponent of that. Some programs may not necessarily agree with me, and that's fine. Apply to programs that do agree with me. And then I think my third piece of advice that I like to give everybody is don't be afraid to take a gap year in between undergrad and graduate school. From my kind of peripheral view of the application process and the interview process, a lot of times I hear that a particular individual is great on paper, is going to make a great genetic counselor someday, but there's a fear that they may not necessarily be mature enough at this point in time because they're just coming out of undergraduate school, and they may not have necessarily found themselves as either a person or found themselves in terms of how intentional they need to be with doing something, or found themselves in terms of this person may have emotional situations way too much on them. They haven't necessarily reached that maturity level to be able to separate certain things. So I think gap years, either 1, 2, several, depending on who you are as a person, depending on what your other options are for having a job and how much you like other fields, is a big player in that. But I always say, don't be afraid to take a gap year. I took a gap year. I think it was the greatest thing I ever did in terms of between undergrad and graduate school. So those would probably be my big 3. Is be intentional about where you apply, gain skills, don't check boxes, don't be afraid to take a gap year.
Okay, that's really, really awesome advice. I love the especially about checking the skills instead of the boxes. I've been trying to think about that lately with how I'm going to frame things on my application and experiences I've had. I think it's really great. I would imagine when you're on an admissions committee and you see, 70 different people that did crisis counseling and someone is framing that experience as a baseball coach instead, that would definitely stand out to me. And I think that's more valuable to find those creative avenues than just what everyone else is doing or what's typically recommended. But definitely been trying to frame things that way. And then also with the maturity aspect and the gap year, at one point I was considering trying to preemptively take a gap year and I guess not even apply in this cycle, maybe try to be a GCA or something and for a year, or even if it was just different work. But I decided I did want to try to give it a go for this cycle. But do you have any experience with what a program means in terms of maturity that people, I guess maybe as a gauge to see if they are mature enough in the eyes of a program?
I think a lot of that comes down to because obviously it's oftentimes difficult to quote unquote um, gauge maturity level through a paper application. So oftentimes those comments are probably only made for an individual that actually is going through the interview process with the program. And I think a lot of that is how you portray yourself as an individual in terms of your communication skills. So you can be great on paper, but maybe not necessarily a great communicator about your thoughts and ideas. And that is the creme de la creme of what genetic counseling is. You have to portray what you're trying to portray in a succinct fashion, in an understandable fashion. So that is one piece of the maturity aspect that I think is important. Another aspect of maturity that I think some individuals get hung up on is, and some people may call this knowledge versus maturity. I realize I'm doing a lot of air quotes right now. I probably am going to look really weird when I watch this back over YouTube, but is just be familiar with the hot topic items of genetic counseling on a day-to-day basis. Because probably through the interview process, you're going to be, currently for this round of interviews, I guarantee you, no matter where you interview, you're going to get a question about how do we increase diversity in the field. So start thinking about that topic. Start thinking about the topics of uh, how you feel about, what does screening for particular conditions over other conditions necessarily mean, or are we putting a value proposition on the individuals that have those particular conditions? So start thinking about those more hot topic, ethical type of issues. And I think a lot of times, if you don't have a cogent response to one of those questions, it may be viewed as you haven't necessarily uh, researched enough into the field, or you might not necessarily be mature enough yet to form a viable opinion on that particular hot topic issue. So I think that can also be a potential area where some individuals receive a view of lack of maturity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally does make sense. And you kind of remind me, so it definitely makes sense. I'm sure the programs know what's best after having so many applicants and so many years of experience, that whatever call they're going to make is probably best for the applicant as well, even though at first it might be kind of disappointing. But in terms of those hot topics and knowing, having done enough research in the field, it's kind of like an interesting kind of conundrum where you don't need to be researching to the extent that you can pass the board exam and become certified before you even take a, enroll in a program. But obviously you have to know enough. And I'm wondering what your resource would be, a suggestion of where to find those hot topics, because I've been doing research obviously about the field, and I even started, someone recommended to me to just like browse through the Guide to Genetic Counseling textbook, but that was
Mhm.
published in like 1997 or something. So I
Uh,
don't want to have a counterproductive knowledge about the field in that aspect.
so if you can follow, I'm probably the worst person to ask about this part because I like don't even have Facebook or social media or any of that jazz. But
Hmm.
if you can follow conversation boards, or I don't know if there's like a Reddit post, but
Yeah.
there's conversation boards on like NSGC that you can potentially follow that have a lot of kind of hot topics. If there are current things that affect genetic counseling going through the legislature at the time, like our bill for Medicare, Medicaid, that could potentially be a good hot topic issue in terms of getting reimbursed. And so, follow your probably your local legislature, because there's probably going to be maybe state laws or licensure laws going through. So that's another hot topic issue is licensure currently with genetic counseling. So legislature, follow discussion boards if you can, either on NSGC or otherwise. There's probably like other Discords or Reddits or whatever it may be. Um, Become part of genetic counseling Facebook groups, both from a genetic counselor side of things as well as from like a potential student side of things. There's probably going to be postings about particular issues on those discussions as well. Again, I'm not well versed in Facebook, so that may be
Hmm.
completely off basis. But also try to follow as much as you can. Sometimes it's hard because there's often paywalls, but oftentimes you can get around those paywalls, or maybe if you're currently in undergraduate school, your libraries can get a lot of literature, if not all of the literature that you want, for free. It just might take a little bit for them. So become friends with your librarians, but um, set up like a Google alert system for particular words: genetic counseling hot topics, genetic counseling diversity, genetic counseling licensure. Um, think about all of these different word combinations that may spit out something on Google Scholar or something on PubMed that relates to some of the current issues that genetic counselors are facing today on a day-to-day basis, on a year-to-year basis. So those are probably the best things that I can think about right now. Um, but there's probably many others. So that might be a good question to continue to ask people as you continue through this awesome interview series. Is what would be the best way to stay up to date on genetic counseling issues. There's probably going to be a lot of other people that have a lot better answers than I did just there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think regardless, that was a great answer, and I definitely am going to look into that a little more with those groups and the actual like literature on what's coming out about this. But yeah, that's really good advice. I'm going to try to maybe focus a little more on that than the older textbooks and everything. But
yeah, there are new editions from time to time, but they don't change all that much.
Exactly. All right. Well, that's all I have for you today, but I really do appreciate you taking the time. This has been one of the best interviews I've had. I've learned a ton from you today. So thank you again so much.
Ethan, I gotta say, I appreciate you reaching out. One, I encourage any prospective student to reach out through the NSGC portal to people in your area or to people remotely, because oftentimes genetic counselors are very willing to have these conversations. I also think that what you're doing with the YouTube channel is incredible. Hopefully you're reaching a much larger audience than what has previously been able to reach, but I should have put this plug at the very beginning. I encourage people to continue to watch your channel. I think it's a really awesome and very unique perspective and opportunity for a lot of people to learn a lot about the field.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's what I was going for. I mean, when I did my first shadowing and like looking into this about 2 years ago, probably, and I started learning about the field, but I also learned that there wasn't a ton out there in terms of things like this, or especially for prospective students. But it's kind of weird. You look on YouTube for genetic counseling, there's only a handful of videos with like a couple hundred views and stuff, but definitely gaining some traction here, and I'm excited to see what happens with it. So I appreciate that a lot.
Were you tech savvy beforehand, or did you just kind of birth yourself into this realm?
I kind of was. I mean, back when I thought about this, but I forget when exactly I, created this idea, but having classes on Zoom for the entirety of the past year definitely helped me know how to work that aspect, and definitely had some experience with YouTube before, but I'm really happy to see how it's panning out. So.
Yeah, well, I gotta say, there's genetic counseling is a very unique field in the fact that you can do so many things: education, clinic, lab, work for insurance companies, work for pharmaceutical companies. Wow, I couldn't think of that word. Marketing is probably going to be a big thing in genetics as well. So having a genetic counselor that with marketing background and YouTube background, that might be another great option as well.
That's a great point. I hadn't really thought about that. There you go. I do love that there's so many different ways you can go with this field. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was great to talk to you, Ethan. If you have any questions in the future, feel free to reach out. If there's a bunch of mean comments on YouTube, just don't send them to me, okay?
Absolutely. All right. Thank you again for your time. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. See ya. All
right, guys, that was Dylan Platt. So I'm going to try to start posting some other things aside from just the counselor interviews, like I was saying, but something that I've been thinking after this interview is maybe some resources on hot topics in genetic counseling, because that's definitely something that's going to be really important for anyone considering going into this field. As Dylan mentioned about interviews and things like that, hot topics are definitely going to come up, and you want to make sure you're staying up to date and not just talking or learning about the older ideas in genetic counseling. So I'm going to look into that a little more, and hopefully I can provide some resources for those up and coming topics, and I'll keep you posted. But other than that, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.